Our speaker this morning is Graham Budd, who's spent more than 30 years working in the technology and semiconductor industry. He was president and chief operating officer at ARM, which is the company that designs the computer chip inside your phone, until he retired last year. He originally studied engineering at Cambridge University, and then during the 1990s, he led the development of some of the first single-chip computer designs in the early days of ARM. Graham ran ARM's processor division from 2005 during the development of computing technology for the smartphone era, before becoming COO in 2008. And he joined the ARM board of directors after the company was acquired by SoftBank in 2016. So Graham is now a non-executive director of an autonomous driving AI company and a trustee of a number of charities, including the Faraday Institute. The title of Graham's talk today is Artificial Intelligence, Humanity in the Age of AI. So welcome, Graham.
Thank you. So, good morning, everyone, and really pleased to have the opportunity to explore this topic with you this morning. I was thinking we could start this with the question: am I real or am I a simulation? And how would you tell? Well, the answer to this question is I am real, but only after I've had the first cup of coffee in the morning. So, the world of AI, artificial intelligence, is pretty interesting right now. You may have seen a couple of weeks ago, a Google researcher was suspended for suggesting that one of their AI language models had become sentient, and he'd actually gone off and tried to hire a lawyer to represent this conscious entity, supposedly conscious entity. Every week at the moment, there seems to be new announcements going on in the media, so it's kind of quite an exciting time. Now, for many of us, our view of AI is influenced by sci-fi and by sort of dystopian predictions of the future. So here's Stephen Hawking from a 2014 BBC interview. Once humans develop artificial intelligence, it would take off on its own and redesign itself at an ever-increasing rate. Humans who are limited by slow biological evolution couldn't compete and would be superseded. And this point where super intelligent AI could exponentially enhance itself is known as the singularity. You may have come across that. And, here's a more transhumanist view of the future from Ray Kurzweil, who is a thinker who likes to push the boundaries of thinking on AI. The singularity will represent the culmination of the merger of our biological thinking and existence with our technology, resulting in a world that is still human, but that transcends our biological roots. There will be no distinction between human and machine, or between physical and virtual reality. So, can we expect to see this chap anytime soon? Well, I don't want to actually make light of or belittle these scenarios because I think they are really important to consider. But I also think these kind of scenarios are way out in the future, if they are indeed possible at all. But we shouldn't preclude it, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk a little bit more about this later on, perhaps in the Q&A. But what I want to focus on today is where artificial intelligence really is at today. And I want to try and bring a theological perspective in here as well to some of the challenging questions that AI poses about what it means to be human, about work and purpose and ethics. I am going to talk from my perspective as a Christian, but I really hope this will stimulate thinking for people of all faiths or none, whatever your background. So actually, just before we get into the AI bit, though, I would just like to revisit the topic of, or the idea, the concept of imago Dei, which a number of previous speakers have talked about this. So, you know, we've had a pretty good summary already. Cara, especially earlier in the week, went through, you know, some of the thinking behind this. You know, this is the idea that human beings are made in the image of God, and therefore endowed with special value and special unique characteristics, including the ability to have relationship with God himself. You know, the Genesis account in the Bible, of which, you know, this verse is a sort of small part of that creation account, really adds purpose and meaning to what we know from science about the creative mechanisms that God used to bring the universe and life into being. The Big Bang, chemistry, evolution, these sort of processes. And it also tells us that God's creation was good. So, and that creation includes humans. So it therefore should also include our capability, which is in his image, to create new ideas and new technology, which includes things like AI. And actually, our ongoing creativity can help sustain the planet, improve lives, and enable all of humankind to flourish. Now, of course, you know, we all recognize human free will means that technology can be used for good or evil, and so there are some risks that we need to manage them. So we're going to talk about that a bit more later on. But, you know, I just wanted to start really by saying, you know, I am definitely a techno-optimist. I think all aspects of our creative abilities are to be celebrated and encouraged, including technology. So let's go on to talk about AI. Lots of definitions of artificial intelligence out there. I particularly like this one, which is from IBM. And artificial intelligence leverages computers and machines to mimic the problem-solving and decision-making capabilities of the human mind. And the reasons I like this, I mean, first of all, I think it's quite practical. It uses the word mimic, which sort of makes it clear that artificial intelligence is a simulation, which I think is quite important. And it also leaves some space there. You know, it talks about artificial intelligence being about the problem-solving and decision-making capabilities of the human mind. So it leaves open the possibility that the human mind is maybe capable of other things beyond those. So it leaves a bit of space for mystery in there. Let's just talk very briefly about the journey that AI has been on over the last few thousand years. I'm just going to pick out a few points which are kind of relevant to what we're going to be talking about later. And by the way, there are so many good books on this. You know, if you want a good backgrounder on AI, my personal favorite is a book by Melanie Mitchell called AI, A Guide for Thinking Humans, but there are loads of them, so you know, you can take your choice. The foundations of AI really built on the desire of early philosophers and theologians to understand the human body, mind, and soul, which developed into then you know, thinking about the mind as a computer and the body as a machine, and how could you simulate these. AI started to make its way into public consciousness through different types of science fiction. The first use of the word robot, as we understand the term today, was by the Czech writer Karel Čapek. He wrote a play in 1920, dystopian play called Rossum's Universal Robots, which we will talk briefly about later. Then in 1942, Isaac Asimov gave us a bit of a precursor of AI ethics with his 3 laws of robotics in a science fiction short story. And around the same time as this, the British computer scientist Alan Turing was considering the question of whether machines could be made to think. And in 1950, he suggested a way to tell if a machine could be considered intelligent, the Turing test, which I'm sure you've probably heard of. The first time we see the term artificial intelligence being used is in 1956 by John McCarthy, as one of the early pioneers of AI. And it's kind of interesting because from those early days, through the 50s and 60s, 70s, there was a bit of a battle of approaches in AI research between what we call symbolic and sub-symbolic approaches. So some groups were more in the sort of symbolic camp, where they're trying to logically replicate the processes of human thinking as we experience them. And others really focus on starting from neuroscience, try and understand the human brain and how that works, and use that to kind of design similar structures for AI. And then in the late 1950s, a gentleman by the name of Frank Rosenblatt, who was an American psychologist, came up with the idea of the perceptron. And the perceptron, basically, this was sort of following the sub-symbolic kind of approach. And the idea there was to try and simulate information processing by a network of neurons, very basic, but in a similar way to the brain. It could learn by adjusting the weightings of its connections. And is actually kind of the forerunner of a lot of what is happening today with modern AI. And then in the second half of the 20th century, we went through this sort of cycle of overhyped expectations for AI. Things got funded, but people had talked up amazing things they were going to achieve. They didn't materialize, and that was then followed generally by what's called AI winter and a funding drought when the results didn't come through. But if we roll the clock forward to 10, 12 years or so ago, then things really began to change pretty rapidly. So you can see here the red bar there. It's kind of showing the development of the internet and mobile computing, and really, as we start to sort of enter the data age. And this has enabled the internet and mobile connectivity, has enabled this new sort of data-driven economy, and that the mass of data enabled new opportunities for AI applications using machine learning algorithms running on deep neural networks, which, as I say, you can think of them as the spiritual successor, if you like, of the perceptron. And obviously a lot more complex, though. Digital neural networks, so I refer to them as DNNs, are trained to simulate a particular task requiring intelligence using vast amounts of training data. And DNN systems actually had already been very, very successful, had demonstrated their credentials, having beaten the human world champions at chess, so IBM Deep Blue, 97, and then AlphaGo in 2016, beating the world Go champion. So you had these two factors happening at the same time: the kind of the rapid development of the technology, but also the external factors, the internet and mobile connectivity, mobile computing, just making it possible for everything to really take off. And because of the commercial opportunities around this, investment has poured into the development of deep neural networks. And this is amazing. This is enabling amazing advances in AI applications, like autonomous vehicles, medical diagnosis, language translation, drug discovery, all of these kind of things. And we have many, many invisible applications around us today using AI built into our phones, or built into the sound system and everything, what's running Zoom and the closed captioning, and it's just all around us. And the pace of development is accelerating. So so that's really sort of the frontiers of AI in terms of what's happening in applications, and it is all driven by the money. What is happening in research? Well, one prize goal for AI is achieving what is called artificial general intelligence, or AGI. And so the way to think about AGI is it is achieving truly human-like AI, which of course is a little tricky to define what that actually means. But I think, one thing that's clear is that the different applications and the AI models that we see today, they're very good at doing a specific task, but they don't reason in the way that a human being does. So we're really still quite a long way away from this. Whatever hype you see in the media about artificial general intelligence being achieved, we're still a very long way away from it. So for many years, the game of Go, I mentioned a minute ago, was considered to be the pinnacle of AI research. It was thought to be the most complex test of human intellectual power. And then this got cracked, 2016, when Google DeepMind's AlphaGo beat Lee Sedol, the world champion. AlphaGo, it's a deep neural network, DNN structure, model that it used, trained on millions of games, and by being able to repeatedly play itself. And it could infer moves that no human could understand. And it's interesting that often those moves were described by human observers as being beautiful. But I think, it was clear that this amazing AI system or model was not in any way sentient or able to understand what it was doing. But it still achieved an amazing result, surpassing human intelligence in that one particular field. So here's another example of things that are going on, today. This was just a few weeks ago, last month, that so Google announced a new AI model called Imagen. And the idea of this is being able to create high quality images from text descriptions. So the example here, an alien octopus, you type in an alien octopus floats through a portal reading a newspaper, and that's what it spews out. If you go to the link there, it's pretty cool actually what it can do. But what's the reason I particularly wanted to mention this one is it's really interesting that Google have chosen not to release. I mean, a lot of the AI models are actually made accessible to other researchers, or in some cases even to the general public. But they've chosen not to make this available because of the risk or the way that it could be used to create deepfake pictures. And all the ethical implications of that. So that's kind of interesting. Now, the hottest topic in AI today, I would say, is natural language processing. And these are huge DNN-based models, get trained on vast amounts of generally written data, feed it the Encyclopedia Britannica, the whole of Wikipedia, whatever you want. And these models can, they're amazing. They can write high quality summaries of text. They can write poetry. They can answer questions seemingly on any topic. The output can be incredibly human-like. Certainly of the latest systems, incredibly human-like. And so, for example, you remember right at the start of this, I mentioned the Google researcher who got suspended. Well, he was, unless it was a publicity stunt, he was fooled by just how realistic this AI was. And what's interesting as well about these models is that developers have found unexpected emergent intelligent capability arising as they get bigger. Now, by that, I don't mean they're suddenly conscious or sentient or anything like that, but just in terms of the complexity and the power of what they are able to do. One example was being able to solve maths problems, just as a result of having kind of absorbed so much data about the world and how everything works. They were suddenly able to solve maths problems, which nobody was really expecting. So, it's that's another interesting property of these. But we've got to remember that they are only models. They are inferring, from their training on a vast data set, they are inferring what might be an appropriate response. So For example, if they're creating a summary of text or creating an answer to a question, sequentially, what might the next word be in a sentence because of the wisdom of all the data that they've taken in. They're just sort of predicting the best option, if you like. But there is no reasoning or understanding behind that in the way that we think about that as a human being. There is a little bit of a problem today, though, in the trend in the size of these models. So this is this graph. So this graph shows different AI systems or models, and then on the y-axis you've got the number of parameters. The way to think about this is that the parameters are similar to the synapses in the human brain. The parameters are where you can create the variation in the models, so that you can add weightings to the decision-making trees that exist in the neural network model. So you can see these different models. They're getting pretty huge. This is an exponential scale, right? And to the extent that the green ones are image recognition, DNN models. So, classic recognize images of cats and all that kind of thing. And then the red ones are natural language processing systems. So at the top there, OpenAI's GPT-4, which hasn't come out yet, and there's a lot of speculation about how big it's going to be. People are talking about up to 100 trillion parameters. Now, the human brain. I think Dennis said yesterday 500 trillion. It's somewhere over 100 trillion anyway. So these systems are starting to get to a similar size potentially to the human brain. But if you think about what they're actually doing, they're doing one specific intelligent task very well. So that just shows the human brain, how efficient the human brain is. And this is actually This is actually quite a problem. From an environmental perspective, climate change perspective, because if we have the OpenAI's GPT-3, 175 billion parameters. Researchers at Copenhagen University claim that training that GPT-3 required energy, causing carbon emissions equivalent to driving to the moon and back. And so, you can see how this scales. It is unsustainable. And so that means that a lot of research is now going into, well, how can we make these architectures, how can we come up with new architectures, rather than just scaling the size of the model, how do we come up with new architectures which are going to be more efficient? And this is where questions about maybe the old sort of symbolic AI I was talking about at the beginning comes back into play a bit, to help create some more efficient architectures. Okay, so for the next section, I want to talk about what it is to be human. And obviously this is a huge topic, so we're just going to look specifically at a few points that are relevant to AI. This is the fuzzy picture, is the Oxford Union debating chamber. And a few months ago, an NVIDIA Microsoft Megatron AI system took part in a debate. At one point, it was asked to argue against the motion, "This House believes that AI will never be ethical." And this was its response. "AI will be ethical. When I look at the way the tech world is going, I see a clear path to a future where AI is used to create something better than the best human beings." Now, based on everything I've said at the moment about how these models work, at one level, this is just a bit of a gimmick. But for our thinking now, it is actually quite interesting because it kind of makes you think about the question, well, what does it mean to be better than the best human beings? Slightly disturbing question, perhaps. The majority of scientific and philosophical thinking today is, as we've actually heard in some of the previous sessions, is based on a presupposition of a material naturalist and usually reductionist view of human intelligence and reason. the idea that we can be reduced to nothing but the atoms from which the neurons and synapses in our brains are made. And for many AI researchers, the implication of this is that fully human-like intelligence in machines is inevitable because we're nothing more than machines ourselves. But this is an assumption. It's a philosophical position. It's an extrapolation from science into metaphysics, really, which often, unfortunately, kind of gets dressed up in science. When sort of taught in schools, etc. And I rather like this quote from Ray Kurzweil again that sort of illustrates some of the challenge in thinking about the human mind. The idea that we're just machines is grounded in early philosophy and exploration of computing. So, for example, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who I guess is best known for his political philosophy, but he is sometimes considered the grandfather of AI because of the way that he explained human reasoning as ratiocination or computing. And Alan Turing, who we were talking about earlier, obviously made amazing ideas that were the foundation of a lot of modern computing. He also played quite a key role in developing the idea that the human mind is like a computer. And then later on, we had Richard Dawkins and the New Atheism movement arguing that a God-free, material-only universe of random chance was the only logical or sort of scientific choice, which then really reinforced this idea of humans being just machines. And, we see this now reflected in the views of individual scientists. So, here's a quote from Francis Crick's book from 1994. The astonishing hypothesis is that your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. And then more recently, Max Tegmark expressed it this way: the conventional wisdom among AI researchers is that intelligence is ultimately about information and computation. This means there is no fundamental reason why machines can't one day be as intelligent as us. So why does all of this matter? Well, I think because a belief that we are nothing but a bunch of atoms diminishes the value and special status of human beings. And it's actually only a few logical steps from there to a belief that individual human lives don't matter, which kind of runs counter to a lot of modern narrative. But that's the implication. And AI is soon, in fact already, able to outshine human intelligence in many specific fields, and that's going to accelerate. So if humans are not special, there's a lot more risk that AI will be allowed to do humans harm or be misused to manipulate and control. So we talked about the concept of humans being made in the image of God, which I, as a Christian, believe that to be absolutely the case. And that means that humans have value, meaning, purpose, which is a really important counter, I think, to this kind of view. And I'd also really like to just suggest that this sort of no more than machines worldview doesn't resonate with our own personal individual experiences of conscious thought, relationships, joys, suffering. I quite like this quote from the Mozambican writer Mia Couto, which says, "Listen, and you will realize that we are not made from cells or from atoms. We are made from stories." That really resonates. And then, Christian theology also speaks to the nature and mystery of knowing deep relationships. That God Himself is deeply relational and wants to be in relationship with his human creations. In the first letter of John in the Bible, God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God, and God in them. God is not constrained by the boundaries of physics or time. So it's not surprising that important parts of our human nature, made in his image, might also transcend the material. And one of the things I found quite interesting, and he's already been mentioned in one of the other talks, is the atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel reaches a similar conclusion in his book Mind and Cosmos, but he does go to great pains not to bring God into it. It's a sort of rational philosophy argument. And he says, excuse me, he says, consciousness is the most conspicuous obstacle to a comprehensive naturalism that relies only on the resources of physical science. The existence of consciousness seems to imply that the physical description of the universe, in spite of its richness and explanatory power, is only part of the truth, and that the natural order is far less austere than it would be if physics and chemistry accounted for everything. So, the position we decide to take on the nature of being human is really important because it has implications for how we develop and relate to artificial intelligences, especially in regard to questions about AI and personhood. So let's just go and talk briefly about this. If we are nothing but atoms in the material world, then it follows that there's no reason why all human characteristics could not eventually be replicated in an AI simulation of a human created by a human. But if there are transcendent elements to our humanity beyond the currently understood laws of physics, then the efforts of humans to create and simulate that will be futile, or would not be possible, right? Because unlike God, we can only use the material world that we have access to in order to create new technology. So that would mean, if you accept that hypothesis, it would mean that there would always be aspects of being human which could not be replicated by an AI, however good the simulation. So, for example, that might include consciousness or experiencing knowing or experiencing relationship, all these kind of things. Maybe, obviously, we all have different opinions on that. But what one thinks about that particular question then influences your thinking in response to the questions that I put up here about personhood. But I think one of the problems here is that even if we come to a conclusion about that question, we still then have the problem of how to be sure. Because even if we, for example, decide that consciousness it somewhat involves some kind of transcendent property that even if we feel that, it will almost certainly be possible to simulate those effects, to simulate consciousness, self-awareness and understanding in an AI. So how do we kind of know? It goes back to my very first question about, am I real or am I a simulation? And then on top of this, we humans have a huge tendency to anthropomorphize, like the Google researcher I mentioned at the start. And I think this is also likely to lead to an increasing clamor for artificial intelligence to have human rights, some form of rights. One risk of anthropomorphism is to make advances in AI look more human than they actually are. And that kind of distracts us from properly understanding AI. But a bigger risk is manipulation. It's pretty straightforward to simulate a degree of emotional intelligence in a machine, which then becomes a powerful mechanism to use to manipulate humans, exacerbated by our tendency to anthropomorphize. Okay, let's move on. So my last two topics are much shorter. So let's just move on to talk a little bit about work and purpose. Will AI take over all of our jobs? How should we think about this? This has been a theme. This isn't new, right? It's been a theme from the Industrial Revolution onwards, thinking about automation. So far, multiple waves of technology have not created mass unemployment, and new types of jobs have always been created. A recent paper in 2019 by a team at Brookings University in the US analyzed the susceptibility of different types of jobs to AI. And the way they did that was by using AI patent filings to link future AI capabilities to different types of specific jobs. And the graph here, which uses their data, shows how strongly different types of jobs are impacted by salary percentile. And so, what's interesting about this is it kind of suggests that actually the jobs that are going to be impacted most are what we would traditionally think of more sort of white-collar jobs, things like doctors and lawyers and, the higher paid jobs up to the right there. And those affected roles, typically they require years of learning and large amounts of knowledge, analyzing legal positions, recommending treatments. And many of us would say, including me, would say, okay, we get that, but you can't replicate the human relationship aspect of a doctor's job, right? But we were just talking about the anthropomorphic tendency, and so we may find people are a bit less concerned about that than we might expect. Now, work is changing, not just because of AI and automation, but also because of human longevity. There's already lots of thinking going on. We're going to need new economic models to be able to deal with that. People are experimenting with things like universal basic income, working patterns changing, gig economy, changing retirement ages. But alongside all of that, how should we think about the purpose and importance of work? And how should we think from a theological perspective? Well, I'm not a theologian, by the way, but just a few thoughts on this. I mean, as a Christian, I think that God himself works in sustaining creation. And if we are humans made in the image of God, it follows that work is good and part of our purpose. And work's also an outlet for the amazing creativity that God has given us. The teaching of Jesus says that work is about serving God and serving others, not about advancing the individual. So from a Christian theological perspective, work should be ultimately about sustaining and enhancing the goodness of creation. But there is a risk that in reimagining work, we choose what may be the wrong paths or destructive paths. I mean, work is hard, as noted in the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible. And modern society seems quite fixated on the idea of the pursuit of individual happiness, so therefore, why not eliminate work? Well, in Karel Čapek's 1920 play, I referred to earlier, the sort of protagonist, old Rossum, has a vision of the future along the lines of the quote that you can read here. And man shall be free and supreme. He shall have no other care than to perfect himself. He will not be a machine and a device for production. He will be Lord of creation. In the play, this results in the apocalyptic destruction of everything. But more likely, perhaps, is that it would lead to the subjugation of most of humanity by a few humans who actually control the economy and means of production using the AI and robots. I think generally insights from theology and history suggest that aspiring to be gods in this way is not likely to end well. Okay, so we're running up against time. So let's move on to the last topic, briefly talk about AI ethics. And last December, a 10-year-old girl in the UK who was bored asked Alexa for a challenge. And this is what Alexa said. Okay, I can't do Alexa voice, sorry, but okay, plug a phone charger into the wall about halfway, then touch a penny to the exposed prongs. And what is this all about? Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because this was really the collective wisdom of the internet saying that is a good and appropriate challenge to do. And it just shows the weakness of today's AI. There is because there's no reasoning, there's no common sense filter that says, whoa, it is not sensible to ask a 10-year-old girl to do that challenge. And this illustrates one point, which is that data ethics is also vital for AI ethics because of the way that these DNNs work. The AI will tend to amplify whatever biases or moral deficiencies are contained in the data. When we talk about AI today, when we talk about AI ethics today, we're generally not thinking about rogue AI like HAL 9000 in the film 2001. What people are concerned about, people and governments are concerned about AI being used by humans in ways that do harm, create bias, violate privacy, and abrogate responsibility for the decisions of AI systems. And all the big tech companies have developed frameworks that actually are pretty similar. This one is Facebook's example. Last 2 points particularly interesting around transparency and control and accountability and governance. But this is how there's a lot of detail behind this. People are trying to build an ethical framework to manage the development of AI. And national governments are also developing regulatory frameworks. One of the first to produce some draft legislation was the EU last year. And their plan is to ban what would be called unacceptable risk systems, which might be those that do biometric surveillance or social scoring. High-risk systems, things like those linked to justice or employment choices, safety-critical systems will be required to operate a set of risk management, governance and decision-making and transparency controls. And this is all, it's a good start. It's a good start. But I just want to explore a few thoughts, maybe going a little bit deeper than that. First of all, we talked about the environmental impact. Well, that is something that is not really being addressed sufficiently today. AI needs to be efficient. Can regulation succeed? Well, here the challenge is that a lot of AI technology is very open and very accessible, so you can make all these rules, but actually will it be possible to keep control of how humans use it? And then I just wanted to talk a little bit about data, because I think that's really important. And we can draw here on the concept of sin in Christian theology, which is sometimes a bit of a maligned and misused word in general society. But for purposes of this, I'll define it using St. Augustine's definition: a word, deed, or desire which is in opposition to the eternal law of God. Okay? Now, data contains a lot of information about people. So deliberately false data could be considered to be a consequence of sin, but even to the extent that data is factually correct, it can be used in ways that result in sin, for example, to exploit or manipulate. And also really, really important is that when taken in aggregate, as it is by an AI model that's trained on vast quantities of data, it can embody sin in the sense of an unfair bias that disadvantages some groups, for example, on the basis of gender or skin color. And our ethics frameworks are, quite focused already on trying to deal with this, but it's really difficult. There's also a specific issue, I think, in training language models from information and online data sources. And remember, these are a path potentially to one of the possible paths to AGI. This data is full of forms of exploitation, lies, misinformation, conspiracy theories presented as fact. Or communication about doing harm. You've just got to go and look at Twitter or Reddit forums. And we can put in place some approaches to try and filter out obvious evils, but we're still left with the detritus of online opinion and misinformation, which may then get amplified by the way that AI works. And then the last point I wanted to make is that I think modern Western society in particular is very attached to the idea that moral frameworks can be relative to individual truth or subjective experience alone, rather than objective absolutes based on external authority or natural law. C.S. Lewis wrote powerfully about the importance of objective values and natural law in his 1943 book, The Abolition of Man. And he draws on objective values from cultures and religions across history and across the world. And although theologians and philosophers might debate what those objectives' values are, the principle of their existence is fundamentally important to avoid a descent into nihilism, which could be exacerbated by AI, because AI can't differentiate between what might be an emotional reaction or a subjective statement and objective fact. If it's in the data, it's data. It's truth. And that just brings me on to the very last point. In the Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis also says this: what we call man's power over nature turns out to be a power exercised by some men over other men, with nature as its instrument. And a risk that applies to all the sections we've talked about here is AI being used to enable some humans or corporations to exercise control over others, widening the inequality gap, or creating a new sort of uber powerful class, or certain companies maybe becoming too powerful. And by the way, this affects not just a risk for AI, but also for things like genetic modification and any type of human augmentation. But particularly important for AI because of the amplifying effect of the way that AI is trained. Also because of the increased susceptibility to manipulation due to anthropomorphism, and indeed the ubiquity of AI. Okay, right, so I think that will do. On the last slide, I've just put, this is a summary of some of the questions that we've been talking about. And obviously we've explored some possible positions and answers and thinking on some of these, but I thought it'd be better just to put the questions up again. Maybe can stimulate some thinking in the next few minutes for Q&A. And by the way, if you want to explore some of this a little bit more, I've included in the slides, at the end of the slides that are on Moodle, I've included a reading list to have a look at. So, okay, that's it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Graham, for a wonderful talk and a lot for us all to take in. I would like to start with a question from online. So one of our participants says, obviously humans are not reduced to machines. How about the other way around? Can we potentially make a humanoid robot in the future that is not different from a human being? Maybe we can make a robot that human properties emerges from those materials that have been put together, and can we upgrade a machine to a human being?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, there's probably two questions in there. I think the first thing to remember is that AI is, remember back to the definition of AI. AI is a simulation. So is it possible to create a human-like robot that appears to a human to be human in all respects? Well, maybe it is possible to do that, but an important question is whether that, even if it appears to be a human, whether it is in fact still a simulation, and whether there is actually then still any difference between that and me as a human being. And I mean, we don't know the answer to that. But I would say, in response to the first part of the question, I would say just the pace at which AI technology is accelerating. We need to get ourselves ready for the idea that over the next, 10, 20 years, we're going to start seeing much more human-like AI interaction taking place. And, and because of people's tendency to anthropomorphize, we're going to see people and the media reacting to that in a way that probably makes it appear that some of those entities are more human than they actually are. So we need to be ready for that. It's one of the reasons it's important to understand some of the background and to have thought this through. And then the other part of the question about sort of emergent behavior. There is a school of thought in AI research which says that if you make these deep neural networks, you remember the chart that I showed with the red and green on it, if you make those big enough, eventually, because they're based on the structure of the human brain, suddenly consciousness, self-awareness, ability to know will spring into life from somewhere just because of the inherent complexity of it. I mean, that is a view. I personally don't agree with that view, but obviously it's not something that one can prove either way. But that's yeah. I mean, I say that is one of the views that some some AI researchers do hold.
Thank you. Do we have any? We do have lots of questions from the room.
Thank you, Graham. I was just wondering if you had any ideas about what would be very good uses of AI to mitigate against some of the things you were talking about, environmental impact, biases, manipulation control, if what the flip side would look like as a really well used technology, a well working industry.
Yes, no, that's a great question. Thanks, Ruth. Well, I actually think we can point to some of the things that AI is already doing today as certainly as part of the answer to that question. I mean, I guess the most obvious one to look at is healthcare, and how AI, which is often actually happening in the background. So things like using AI to enable the prediction of protein folding, and therefore to make it possible to discover drugs that you just wouldn't be able to discover by randomly testing over many years. So, that's one example. So it's called indirect healthcare examples, and there's direct healthcare examples where you're using AI in the context of patient-doctor relationships, and using the gathering of large quantities of data to enable much more effective diagnosis of conditions much more quickly. We're starting to see some of this happening, but the potential is enormous. But one of the challenges we have, of course, is there's a conflict between doing that and realizing the individual benefits for people who are ill as a result of a collective effort to use data. Because in order to get the best insights and to be able to train the AI models to give the best insights, you need to have data from many, many people. And then, of course, that raises concerns about individual privacy and how we manage that. And you've got to hold those two things in balance, the collective good, if you like, versus the risk to individual privacy. So healthcare is one huge area. And things like individualized cancer therapies, or enabling individualized cancer therapies using AI. And then I think another, sorry, I could go on for hours about this question, but I won't. But another example would be thinking about accessibility and how AI can enable, for example, through autonomous vehicles, AI can enable accessibility for people with disabilities who currently, can't get around. But in the future, of sort of self-driving vehicles, people will be able to get around. And autonomous vehicles will also be able to make our lives more efficient and a lot safer. Might not necessarily feel like it right now, because the only media articles we ever seem to see are things like saying, self-driving car runs pedestrian over, or something like that. But the technology is and will be much safer, in fact, than human drivers. So I think there is lots and lots of opportunities and potential at the level of individual applications to really improve lives and enable human flourishing, and actually enable better equality and access to opportunity and all these good things. But as we talked about, there's also some huge risks to manage along the way. So I hope that helps.
Thank you. There's two questions online that I think maybe are interrelated, so I'll pose both. What exactly are humans trying to achieve by understanding not only the physical traits of people, but equally emotions and responses to external stimuli through AI? And the other question is, I believe love and fear might be the main feelings that characterize humans. Other than tasks, are there any advances in AI understanding feelings?
Okay, so why? I guess the first question was really sort of why are we trying to understand human emotions and everything in the context of AI? Well, I think there's, like most of these questions, there's sort of two sides to the answer. In order to provide, I mean, think about a medical interaction, for example, with some kind of AI diagnosis system. I mean, you would want that to feel as human-like as possible for the user, because that's what we as humans want to experience. And in order to do that, you need to understand how human emotions and thinking and awareness really works, so that you can simulate it to the best degree that you can. So that's kind of the positive side of the answer to the question. But maybe a negative angle on this would be, it may be the case that some people or corporations, obviously AI creates huge commercial opportunity. In the case of some governments or corporations or people, it also creates the opportunity for surveillance or manipulation or control. And if you're going to manipulate, even if you're not starting from the viewpoint of, I'm going to be evil and manipulate people, you might just be starting from the viewpoint of, I want to make more money, and therefore I need to target my advertising in this way, or whatever it is, and then it can be a bit of a slippery slope from there. But if you're going to do that, then you need to understand how our emotions work and how humans interact, so that you can simulate that again, but for maybe less wonderful purposes. So like everything, there's sort of two sides to the coin. But those are, and I hope, and I think actually that the reason why most people are thinking about that question is the former rather than the latter. But who knows?
Thank you. So I'll take a couple of questions from the room. So you talked a little bit about the idea of rights for AI. Do you think there's a case that AI should have rights, not because it's a person, but because it simulates a person? For example, like, should it be okay to verbally abuse a chatbot, not because it's a person, but because you are kind of practicing doing that on something that looks like a person?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, yes, some people might feel it's quite enjoyable to verbally abuse a chatbot, to have an outlet to vent your frustration on or whatever. But I mean, I think there might be an interesting analogy here with how we think about animals, which we touched on in some of the other sessions. But I do think that the question of whether you should give some level of rights to an entity is not just dependent on the actual sort of purely rational position as to whether they are conscious or sentient or whatever. We're human beings. We anthropomorphize, and therefore, I mean, if you think about animal rights, for example, I mean, there's obviously a spectrum of opinion on that question, but I think most people would agree that we do anthropomorphize, as far as animals are concerned, and that for some people at least, part of the reason why they may take a more extreme view on animal rights is because at least anthropomorphism contributes to that extreme view. And I think we have to be realistic about that and take into account. When thinking about AIs, you may end up with a situation where, yes, it is only a simulation, but an incredibly good one. But if that makes us as humans, remember, in the value I've been saying right through, humans have unique and special value created in the image of God. So if having an AI that is, apparent that the simulation is so good that it looks like a human, then and that then makes humans uncomfortable about it not having some kind of very limited level of sort of rights, in the sense that you don't abuse it or whatever it is, then yeah, maybe we should do that. The interesting question is, if you do that, are you actually giving it rights, or are you just, is what you're actually doing setting a bit of a moral framework for the human who is interacting with it? And the emphasis is more on that side rather than the AI itself and the rights that you're giving it.
Thank you. I'll take another question from the room. Mr. Bray.
Yes, towards the end of your talk, you showed a slide which included a little image from the movie 2001, HAL, the computer. And if you recall, I'm sure everybody's seen this, in the movie, HAL is ultimately defeated by the only surviving crew member when he does something that is completely irrational, totally stupid, that HAL can't anticipate because it's not part of it. It just doesn't see that coming. And I'm wondering whether this sort of irrationality and the capacity for doing completely unpredictable and sometimes quite stupid things can distinguish human intelligence from AI, for better or for worse.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. Where and sort of where does that irrationality come from, and is it sort of another part of evidence for true free will and non-deterministic behavior, and all of that. Yeah, I think it's a great point. I mean, my personal view, as seen from the presentation, is that yes, that is one of the things that differentiates humans from anything that we are going to be able to replicate in an AI simulation. But and therefore, therefore you're unlikely to end up in a sort of HAL 9000 kind of situation as plays out in that film. But I do think it's really, really important that, because we cannot know, right? So it's really important that we, I think, remain open to the idea that AI may progress in ways that or indeed neuroscience may progress in ways that create surprising discoveries about how the human brain works that kind of, we have to readjust our thinking, or I have to readjust my thinking, right? I mean, at the moment we just don't know. But it's a great question and a great thought. Thank you.
I'm going to use chair's privilege and keep going for a couple more minutes. I'm going to combine two questions from online. How does a machine know ethics? Does it have to be programmed to do so, and who does it? And the second question is, are autonomous devices ever self-motivating beyond a human input?
Okay, you might have to remind me of the second question afterwards. But are machines, how do machines know ethics? Well, the way that, let's say, the vast majority of AI implementations today, they're these deep neural networks, and the only way that they learn is through data. I mean, there are more complex architectures in terms of how that data or how the output from the network is fed back into itself to reinforce particular bits of learning. There's a whole load of complexity in the detail there around how these things work. But at the end of the day, their learning is entirely on the basis of the data that you feed them. So if you want to try and train an AI in moral principles or ethics, then you have to treat it as being, it's a bunch of facts in data, through which the algorithm, like it does for anything else, can look at, it's looking at the different words, how those words are used in the context of other words in sentences across millions of sentences, and being able to form some sort of meaningful output that to us might look like it's taking a reasonable ethical position, but it's just a simulation. So that's the situation today. Now, that is because we have ended up going down this path of, DNNs are the way that we've just created this explosive opportunity, exponential growth in AI following the money. It may be that there are other types of AI architectures and approaches that can, that can take a slightly more reasoning kind of approach to sort of more like a human reasoning kind of approach, or a symbolic approach to the problem, that may be able to address moral and ethic questions better but that's really not really what exists today. Sorry, what was the second half again?
I think you may have answered it. Are autonomous devices ever self-motivating beyond a human input?
Well, no, certainly not at the moment. I mean, one of the big things for AI, which I actually didn't mention in the talk, was about purpose. And when we design or train an AI model, it has some kind of purpose defined by the human. It's going to play the game of Go and beat the world Go champion. That's its purpose. It doesn't do anything else. It is going to drive an autonomous vehicle. And you could train one of these networks to do multiple of those things, but you're still defining all those things and what the purposes are. A really interesting and scary thing would be if AIs started somehow becoming capable of developing their own purpose, because at that point, and that goes back to the very first slide, right? And these possible rather more dystopian scenarios and the singularity and all of that kind of thing. Yeah, anyway, sorry, I've gone slightly off topic there, but I think that answers the question.
We could clearly go on for hours. I'm going to take one more question from the room.
Yeah, it's just a quick comment and a question. So just a comment was, I'm sure this is probably in your reading list, which I haven't looked at yet, but I was just thinking of the earlier question about, could we make computers feel and all that, made me think of Rosalind Picard, who's head of the Effective Computing Laboratory at MIT. And if people haven't yet seen it, she has a paper number 24, Faraday paper number 24, The Future of AI and Human Identity, which touches on that, and just thought I'd flag that up, as it's free, download, and easy to read, etc. My question is a bit speculative here, and I suppose I speak as a biologist, but I was just reflecting on what you were mentioning about the huge energy demands of the latest big, huge networks and how much, carbon output they have and all that sort of thing. And I've often wondered whether, in terms of the more exotic and ambitious and, sort of almost transhuman type of ways of creating, consciousness and all that through AI, I've sometimes just wondered, well, maybe the only way to do that is through these squidgy biological materials that we have already. Because materials, often things come down to, if you want to have something with that tiny bit of energy usage and that, really efficient output and that complexity, which is between our ears as we speak, could it be the case, actually, that's the only way of doing that? Because those are the materials you need to do that particular job. And we know that, I mean, it's a bit speculative, but I've sometimes wondered about that. And therefore, I mean, there are some wonderful ways of making people, which are quite cheap and lovely and so forth. So I don't know, this is speculation, but I throw that out. It's really a question about materials and the sorts of materials used to make networks and where they're going.
No, it's a really interesting question. Yeah, I think, I think the first point to note is that current progress in AI is actually all backed up by neuroscience, and therefore ultimately, the materials, if you like, of the structures of the way that the brain works. So, actually that's kind of where we are today. But in terms of the question of whether there might be some sort of ultimate dependency on, needing to use that kind of those materials or that kind of structure to create something intelligent, I mean, obviously don't know the answer to that question. But I think that question sort of takes us more into the domain of starting to think about transhumanism. Because you have sort of people thinking about, brains in jars and is one still human if you're sort of floating in a jar. And it takes us into transhumanism. It takes us into thinking about human augmentation and how you could potentially augment the human brain, so that effectively, it was the quote from Ray Kurzweil right at the beginning about this idea that humans and technology and AI will start coming together, and there's no sort of boundaries between the virtual and the real and all this kind of thing. So, simple answer to your question is, none of us know whether there's something really special about the way the human brain is constructed that means that you kind of need to use that structure in order to deliver truly intelligent capabilities. But it raises a whole load of really, really interesting questions, which would be wonderful to discuss if we had another hour. But I don't. And just mention one last thing. Just your first point, absolutely yes. The Rosalind Picard's paper is on the reading list, and the other one I'd recommend to you on the reading list is there's a book which came out of some Faraday Institute research from published last year called "The Robot Will See You Now," which is a sort of collection of essays. Edited by John Wyatt and Stephen Williams, and I'd recommend that as another good source to read through. If you want to get a perspective that brings in a Christian theological perspective on thinking about some of these issues around AI as well, that's a good place to go.
Last question.
So it's a question on training data and choosing our training data sets. So Microsoft helpfully shows with Tay that training your bot on Twitter is a terrible, terrible idea.
Yep.
If we were to train our bot instead on the Bible and the collected works of C.S. Lewis, and our training data were to consist of sitting down with it and doing Bible studies, either to make an AI that was actually trained on something really helpful or to make an AI theologian, what might the prospects of that be?
Well, it'd be fairly straightforward. It sounds like an interesting piece of research to do, actually. But the problem with it, I suspect, is going to be that, for example, when you read the Bible, I mean, the Bible is quite a long book, but the different chapters in the Bible are all set in their different contexts of historical narrative or allegorical narrative, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And for an AI just sort of absorbing that data, the AI is just going to treat it all the same, if you like. And so I think training an AI on just those theological sources, if you like, it would not be sufficient. You'd have to somehow bring in a fairly vast corpus of other work that would help it to. I'm anthropomorphizing now because I'm using words like it would help it to understand. Of course, I can't think of another way of saying it. But it's a really, really interesting question. But I think we probably wouldn't get much of an interesting result just by using the Bible or even the works of C.S. Lewis. Yeah.
Thank you, Graham, for a wonderful talk and for fielding such a wide range of questions. Obviously, we could go on for hours, but we really must have coffee now. So thank you once again.